In 1960s Krakow, a quiet, intelligent teenager from a respectable family began stalking the city's most vulnerable. No one suspected that behind his reserved exterior lay a fascination with knives, blood and violence, and that he would attack without motive, without warning, and without fear of being caught. This is the story of the boy who became known as the Vampire of Kraków. Hello and welcome to Prash's Murder Map. Please be aware that this episode is more graphic than many of my previous cases and includes references to animal cruelty and suicide. It should have been obvious from his early years that Karol Kot was not a normal child, although he hid it well from his parents and teachers. He was born on 18th of December 1946 in post-war Poland, behind the Soviet Union's Iron Curtain of censorship and political repression. As a toddler, he seemed quiet and trouble-free. His father was an engineer and his mother a social worker, and they provided him with a stable, loving home. They encouraged his interests, paying for karate lessons and later for the rifle club he enjoyed attending. Karol never missed school and impressed his teachers with his intelligence, but his shyness made it difficult for him to form friendships. Apart from occasional bedwetting, his childhood appeared normal. But everything changed when Karol was 8 and a new member of the family arrived. At first, he helped his parents care for his baby sister, but he soon became jealous of the attention she received. When they were alone, he would punch her and even threw her pet cats against the wall. This wasn't the only sign of cruelty. Other children at school began to notice that Karol took pleasure in kicking dogs and pulling cats' tails. In class, he still played the part of an introverted, clever boy, but his classmates increasingly found him strange and unsettling. Karol began collecting knives and books about martial arts and weapons. He made disturbing comments, including a fantasy about cutting off a girl's head and sending it to her mother in a box. He frequently taunted other pupils and once punched a boy in the stomach without provocation. He was aggressive and unpredictable and repeatedly tried to molest female students. On one occasion, he brought a knife into school and mimed slitting someone's throat. On another, he pinned playing cards to a board and used them as targets to practice throwing knives. As a teenager, Karol went on a family holiday to the rural village of Przed in southern Poland. There, he moved beyond throwing knives at playing cards and began throwing them at rabbits instead. During a walk one day, he came across a slaughterhouse and stopped to watch the employees at work. Expecting his bravado to disappear when he saw a calf being killed, the workers jokingly offered him a cup of fresh, warm blood, hoping to scare him off. Instead, Karol drank it. He later said, "I liked the sight and finally got a taste of blood. I drank the blood of a calf and a hog, then I killed frogs, chickens, rooks, moles and calves." At home, he would shoot at objects around the house with his airgun, using books and even the meat his mother had bought for dinner as targets. But knives were his real obsession. He later said, "I collected them, bought them, replaced them, ordered knives according to my designs. I always carried them with me. I think it was probably my greatest love for the object. For me, the knife was a living thing. It was me." Karol's cruelty didn't stop with animals. During a school trip to Auschwitz, many students were deeply affected by the horrors they had learnt about. Born in the immediate aftermath of World War II, many of the children had grown up hearing stories from parents or grandparents who had lived through the conflict. some of whom had been victims or survivors themselves. But the gravity of the sight was lost on Karol. Instead, he imagined himself as a camp commander and boasted to his classmates that he could devise even better ways to torture and kill people than the Nazis had. By this time, Kot was secretly using his pocket money to expand his knife collection and had begun studying human anatomy. He spent more time on this than on his schoolwork, and in his final year of high school he even failed Polish. Despite that, he later enrolled as a student at a local technical institute. Given his fascination with violence and his apparent lack of empathy, it was perhaps only a matter of time before his fantasies turned into reality. That moment came on Monday 21st of September 1964. 17-year-old Karol Kot was loitering outside the Church of the Sacred Heart of Jesus on Gonczarska Street, Krakow, when he noticed 48-year-old housekeeper Helen Veljon, though he didn't know her name at the time. As Helen entered the church, she briefly noticed a young man standing outside. A small red shield stitched onto his sleeve identified him as a student. She walked down the aisle and knelt in prayer before the altar. Kot followed Helen into the church. While she was absorbed in her prayers, he crept up behind her and plunged a knife into her back, then fled the building. As Helen collapsed to the floor, she caught a brief glimpse of him and recognised him as the student she had passed on her way inside. After reaching a secluded spot, Kot took the knife from his pocket and licked the fresh blood from the blade. Shocked, frightened, and with blood dripping from a wound just below her shoulder blade, Helen Veljon managed to report the attack to the police in Krakow. She described her attacker as a young man between 16 and 18 years old, with dark hair, dark trousers, and what she remembered as a strangely friendly face. The police chose not to investigate, as at the time, the authorities preferred to keep violent crime out of the newspapers. As a result, the public remained unaware that a dangerous lunatic was roaming the city with a knife. Karol Kot struck again just 2 days later on Wednesday. 76-year-old Franziska Lewandowska had no idea she was being watched as she walked home from the tram stop to her apartment. She was carrying several bags of groceries, many of which she planned to donate to poorer neighbours in the area. At around 1:30 in the afternoon, she entered the building and began climbing the stairs. She heard footsteps behind her and glanced over her shoulder to see a student following her. Unconcerned, she continued upwards, assuming he was just another resident or visitor. Suddenly, Kot stepped forward and drove a knife into her back. He didn't stop to see the effects of his actions, and he didn't take anything from her. Instead, he ran down the stairs and into the street. Moments later, Franziska collapsed in the stairwell. 3 residents found Franziska soon after the attack, and she was rushed to hospital, where doctors discovered that the knife wound in her back had narrowly missed her heart. Franziska survived, but spent months receiving treatment and had to walk with a cane when she returned home. When she described the assailant, the police realised they had been wrong to dismiss Helen Veljon's report. It now seemed likely that both attacks were the work of the same assailant. They were baffled as to the motive. It was neither robbery nor sexual assault. But Kot didn't need a motive. He simply wanted the thrill of hurting others. He had now attempted 2 murders, yet he had failed to satisfy his urge to take a life. He waited less than a week before his next experiment. Once again, his victim was an elderly woman. At St. John's Church in the centre of Krakow's Old Town, 86-year-old Maria Plichter was reading the church notice board. Suddenly, she felt an agonising pain in her back and collapsed, gasping for breath. A nun passed by moments later, and Maria was able to whisper the words, "young man," before losing consciousness. She had been stabbed directly through her lung. While Maria underwent emergency surgery, Karol Kot boldly entered the hospital and asked about the old lady who had been attacked and whether she was still alive. Despite the doctor's efforts, Maria succumbed to her injuries the following day. Kot had finally achieved what he wanted. He had escalated from a troubled teenager with a taste for animal cruelty to a cold-blooded killer of the old and vulnerable, and he had no intention of stopping. A hospital receptionist grew suspicious when Kot asked about Maria, as the attack hadn't yet been made public. She reported him to the police, reasoning that there was no way he could have known about it unless he was involved. Unfortunately, the receptionist described him as a man between 35 and 40 years old, which misled investigators. They were, however, now convinced that the murder and the two previous attacks were connected. On 2nd of October, they set up a task force and re-interviewed Helen Valjean. But despite the new information, they continued to rely on the receptionist's description rather than the accounts of Helen and Francisca. Media censorship was temporarily relaxed to alert the public, sparking a level of fear and paranoia rarely seen in post-war Krakow. Some women strapped pillows, shields, and even saucepans to their backs for protection. One woman, convinced she was being followed, ran and slipped, breaking her hip. At the hospital, doctors noticed she had a cast iron pot lid tied to her back. Detectives visited hospitals and churches, trying to gather information about the killer, but widespread public mistrust of the authorities meant few witnesses came forward. Around 500 people were questioned, many of them ex-convicts, but the investigation hit a dead end. The police commissioner admitted, "There was no motive, and we are looking for a needle in a haystack." With no further attacks, they concluded that the perpetrator was likely mentally ill and had since been institutionalized. What they didn't realise was that Karol Kot was still very much at large. He'd been plotting the murder of a fellow student, but his plan fell apart when she declined his invitation to go on a date. Next, he tried arson, but it didn't give him the same satisfaction as directly harming someone. Instead, he purchased sodium arsenate, a toxic pesticide, and surreptitiously dropped it into open lemonade and beer bottles in cafes around the city. Dissolving easily and difficult to detect once mixed, the substance caused nausea and vomiting in those who consumed it. The doses were not lethal, and the incidents appeared isolated, leaving no suspicion of deliberate poisoning and no link to Kot. In January 1965, the task force was disbanded and the public's fears slowly eased. The so-called old lady killer would return about a year later, the poisoning experiments long forgotten. This time, however, he would target very different victims. On 13th of February 1966, 11-year-old Leszek Sławek was excited about the toboggan competition at Krakow's snow-covered Kosciuszko Mound, a mini mountain overlooking the city and the Vistula River. But his sled was damaged and he was disqualified, which was a crushing disappointment after weeks of practice. As he trudged home, a dark-haired man with a friendly smile approached him and asked why he looked so sad. Leszek opened his mouth to explain, but before he could speak, the man drew a fearsomely sharp blade and lunged. There was no time to react. The man stabbed him 11 times, piercing all his major organs. Leszek was left lying in the snow, his glasses askew, and his hands still gripping the rope of his toboggan. 15 minutes later, a passerby discovered the boy's body. The police sealed off the area, and 100 officers searched for clues but found nothing. The level of brutality and overkill shocked even the forensic pathologist. Investigators concluded that the man who had attacked Helen Veljon, Franziska Lewandowska, and Maria Plichter in 1964 had returned. Having previously targeted the elderly, he was now hunting the young. Another task force was formed and police published details of the murder in the newspapers, appealing to the public for help. Even in such a serious case, the story was limited to local Krakow papers. In a diabolic twist, the Volunteer Civic Militia Reserve, for which Karol Kot was a member, was called in to help search for Leszek Szwawek's killer, giving him access to all the inside information about the investigation. On Thursday, 14th of April 1966, 8-year-old Małgosia was bored at home in the Sobieska apartment where she lived with her parents. She'd been sick for a couple of days, and although her mother urged her to rest, she wanted to go outside. Spotting the postman through the window, she decided to go downstairs to fetch the mail. She put on her coat and ran to the front door, greeting an older boy who was sitting on the stairs along the way. Reaching up to the mailbox, she was suddenly grabbed from behind and a hand was clamped firmly over her mouth. It was the youth from the stairs. Małgosia felt 8 tremendous blows around her body, yet she somehow staggered back up to her apartment. She whispered, "A man beat me up," before collapsing into her distraught mother's arms. Hospital doctors found 5 stab wounds in Małgosia's back, 2 in her abdomen and 1 in her left hand. Thankfully, the 8-year-old recovered and was able to describe her attacker. A taxi driver who'd been passing by at the time corroborated her description. He had seen a dark-haired man, around 18, with a student patch on his arm, leaving the apartment block. The police now realised they had been wrong to believe the killer was between 35 and 40, so they released a second description, this one closer to what Małgosia and the other 2 older women had reported. Shortly after the attack, Karol Kot brazenly knocked on the door of Małgosia's apartment and asked her mother for the name of the girl who'd been injured. She stared at him open-mouthed. Kot simply said, "Don't worry, I'll look it up in the papers," before quickly leaving. Małgosia's father ran after him, but the stranger had vanished without a trace. A few days later, investigators received a tip-off about a college student who collected knives. 19-year-old Karol Kot. Fooled by his politeness and his respectable family, the police eliminated him as a suspect. His interest in knives and his gun club membership didn't raise alarm, as his shooting club coach vouched for him, saying that collecting knives was a harmless hobby. A couple of months later, after winter had given way to a warm summer, Karol went on a day trip with his only friend, 22-year-old art student Danuta, to the historic village of Tyniec, about 10 miles southwest of Krakow. They had known each other for a few years as they went to the same shooting club and sometimes went for walks together after practice. Karol had made it clear he had feelings for her, but Danuta just wanted them to be friends. Although she disliked his morbid sense of humour, she thought he was intelligent and had a softer side. During the trip, Karol confided in her that he had stabbed a girl in an apartment building earlier that year. As they were walking through the forest, he suddenly pushed Danuta to the ground and held a knife to her throat, threatening to kill her if she told anyone what he had said. Danuta reminded him that if he hurt her, he would be caught, as everyone at the shooting club knew they had gone out together. In response, he produced a shard of glass from his pocket and told her he would kill her and dispose of her body in the river to make it look like suicide. Danuta was extremely unsettled but didn't really believe he would hurt her. The pair returned to Krakow without further incident, but Danuta later reported the disturbing events to the police. Although they had previously ruled out Kot as a suspect, they were alarmed by Danuta's statement and realised that he fitted all the facts. Detectives placed Kot under surveillance but waited to arrest him until after his final school exams to ensure he could be tried as an adult. Passing the exams would also support the case that he was of sound mind. In the meantime, they discreetly gathered evidence questioning the man who had sold him custom-made knives and matching the types of knives Kot owned to the injuries inflicted on his victims. The day after his final exams, Kot went into the forest to shoot birds. It was there that police took the opportunity to bring him in for questioning. A search of his family home revealed 16 knives, books about human anatomy, a crossbow, notebooks filled with sketches of knives, and a jar of sodium arsenate. The evidence was overwhelming, and Kot was arrested on suspicion of murder and multiple attempted murders. During questioning, Kot's polite, friendly veneer began to crack, revealing the arrogance that lay beneath. An identity parade was held and multiple witnesses pointed him out. When Franziska Lewandowska identified him, Karol looked her in the eye and sneered, "I wish I'd drained the rest of your old blood." Realising there was no point in denying his crimes, he instead took perverse pleasure in giving theatrical descriptions of the murders. He admitted to deliberately targeting lone victims who were very old or young, striking from behind to catch them off guard. Kot showed no sign of remorse as he explained that after stabbing 11-year-old Leszek Sławek, he had bought himself a cake and returned home, sleeping soundly all night. Kot reenacted his crimes for investigators, smiling at the camera and posing for photos, which made the female police officer acting the part of the victim feel deeply uncomfortable. When he hit her with the replica rubber knife hard enough to make her fall, he laughed coldly. The police had believed reenactments would help them understand how Kot had committed his crimes, but they had instead become a stage for him to play the lead role in his own macabre performance. Enjoying the attention, he called out instructions to the camera operator, such as, "Light here, are we stabbing now? Camera." After he revealed that he had licked his knife after every attack to taste his victim's blood, the press dubbed him the Vampire of Kraków. Kot was found to be sane, and his brain scans revealed no abnormalities, leaving many unanswered questions about how someone could commit such brutal murders with neither motive nor remorse. When asked to explain his actions, he calmly stated, "Suffering is beauty. Inflicting pain and suffering on someone is a work of art. Not everyone can do it." He even offered to remove undesirable people from the streets as a service to society, convinced that he was performing a civic duty. At the trial, the courtroom was packed with journalists, victims' families, and curious onlookers. An old school friend later recalled, "Kot sat in the dock with a cold, glazed stare and a characteristic smirk on his face. It reminded me of some images of Hitler. It was the kind of look that said, 'I'm going to do this and that to you, and what are you going to do about it?'" On 14th of July 1967, Karol Kot was found guilty on 2 counts of murder, 10 attempted murders, and 4 counts of arson. He was sentenced to death by hanging. Kot seemed indifferent, remarking, "If I could, I would murder again. The suffering of the victims gave me happiness. I had grand criminal goals, and the only thing I regret is not achieving those. If there was a war, I would have liked to be the head of a concentration camp. I dreamed of mass murders in gas chambers, roundups, and dismemberment. Unfortunately, I did not make it." He went on to say that he wished to murder all women except his sister and cousin, and described a series of deeply disturbing fantasies. When asked whether he'd gained any form of gratification from his crimes, he replied, "I can only describe how I felt after the murders. I was calming down immediately. I was somewhat free. Evil voices departed from me. I slept better. It was a moment of joy for me to wipe the blood off the knife with my finger and then lick it. I did not think about punishment for myself, but about pleasure. In his final hours, 21-year-old Karol Kot said goodbye to his parents, smoked a cigarette, drank a glass of water, and listened to some final words from a priest. At 6:50 p.m. on 16th of May 1968, he calmly stepped onto the gallows. His death was swift and quiet, marking the end of a life consumed by violence, but leaving behind lingering questions for the victims' families, the local community, and psychologists alike. You've been listening to Prash's Murder Map. If you'd like to support the show, please leave a thumbs up, comment, rating or review. Patreon supporters get access to ad-free, audio-only episodes, and you can also sign up separately to my free newsletter via my website for news and updates. I'll leave the links in the show notes. Thanks for your support, and I'll see you again soon.